These lectures are made possible by the Leo Lowenstein Foundation, and I'm very grateful for their support. The topic today is WikiLeaks, and I think this discussion may go in a number of directions, but I expect the focus, at least initially, will be on the implications of the release of diplomatic cables for national security on one hand, and freedom of the press on the other hand. More generally, I think what we'll do is consider the role of organizations like WikiLeaks going forward and how we want to think about their value and their costs.
Our two speakers are really well qualified to consider these issues, so let me introduce them. Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor in Middle East Policy Studies, and he is former ambassador to Israel and Egypt. He was the U.S. Ambassador to Israel 2001 to 2005, and the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt from 1997 to 2001. Before he held those positions, he served in numerous roles in the State Department. Among them, he was a political officer at the American embassies in Cairo and Tel Aviv. He was Deputy Director of the Office of Egyptian Affairs, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. And he's also been very important in efforts to achieve peace in the Middle East. He crafted the 1988 Peace Initiative of Secretary of State George P. Shultz. And in 1991, he served as a member of the U.S. peace team that brought about the Madrid Peace Conference. So during Q&A, people are allowed to ask him about the Middle East, too. Barton Gellman, class of 1982, is a senior research fellow at the Center on Law and Security at New York University. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist, blogger, and best-selling author. He's the author of a book, which is a wonderful book, Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency, which was published in 2008. He's a contributing editor-at-large to Time magazine. And until 2010, he was a special projects reporter at the Washington Post. His series on Dick Cheney, in collaboration with Joe Becker, won a 2008 Pulitzer Prize, a George Polk Award, and the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting. He also shared a Pulitzer for national reporting in 2002. And his work has been honored by the Overseas Press Club, the Society of Professional Journalists, and the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And he's one of our most loyal and valuable alumni. So I really thank him for coming, and for Ambassador Kurtzer for coming too. We're going to structure this as a very informal discussion, and I will open with a question, which I'll ask both of our speakers to comment on, which is, you know, national security is often used as a justification to overcome certain constitutional protections. And I'd like to start by asking each of you about, you know, where you think we should draw the line. You know, how do we balance these two things? Or maybe in the WikiLeaks case, you don't think that there's any question about what that balance should be. Dan, would you like to start?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Look, in the nurture and nature debate, you're going to hear a lot about nurture. Where I came from the last 30 years is working in the national security infrastructure of our country. And so I have some very strong feelings about WikiLeaks that you'll hear in the course of this evening. And with respect to Chris's question, I think it goes right to the heart of the matter. The American people have handed to our government responsibilities, both deriving from the Constitution and deriving from congressional legislation that includes responsibility for national security affairs. And part of that is going to be a need for the maintenance of security and secrecy with regard to certain kinds of information. We don't question it very often on issues related to intelligence or military plans. We are now questioning it on issues related to diplomacy for reasons that I think make no sense, because diplomacy is as important an asset of our national security infrastructure as any of the other power issues that we normally talk about. So we have a situation.
Yeah, I'm sorry, pardon me. And please don't take this personally. I think the microphones might be happier if we're just a tiny bit further apart and just guessing.
Nothing to do with your viewpoints.
I see we've started already. Everybody okay with this? Bart, you okay? Yeah?
But,
Yeah, okay. Where was I? So, the argument I think that I would like to frame in terms of my viewpoint on this is that if diplomacy is, as I argue it is, an essential component of our national security assets and the relationships that we establish around the world, then diplomats have the same responsibility to protect information that's given to them and to know that what they report to Washington, including the policy inputs that they make from the field or in Washington, will enjoy a certain amount of protection. It doesn't get into the area at all, and we may want to talk about this a little bit later. I don't think it gets into the area at all of a right to know on the part of the American people. I mean, if Congress legislates that our diplomatic reporting should be unclassified, then it'll be unclassified. Until that happens, though, I think the American people understand that there's going to be a level of secrecy to what we report as diplomats and what our policymakers learn from our diplomatic reporting that contributes to the overall national security.
thanks. And I do want to say that I'm genuinely honored to be in this company of one of the most capable diplomats of this generation. I've followed from afar for a long time.
Wait till what follows now. This is the warm-up.
No, don't let it be said. Don't let it be said that our diplomats are not honorable people. I actually proposed in advance of this thing that we block it out like professional wrestling. And I even agreed to be the villain. You know, I'd have him on the ropes for a while, and then in the end, I'd take my fall. And he declined. So I think that you know, a journalist, sort of an advocate for openness, could come in here and talk only about all the ways that openness is valuable. And I think that that would miss the hard question here. I think that national security secrecy is truly a conflict of core values that are enunciated in the Constitution, and beginning with we the people who are supposed to be sovereign, and you know, the six, not one, six purposes that the preamble says our government is about, one of which is about national defense. On the one hand, you have, essentially it's self-government versus self-defense. And the conflict is never more heightened than in wartime, because any information that the public knows will be known to the enemy, and that can have tough consequences for protecting the open society that we are. Although secrecy does not coincide with security, there are plenty of times when you can demonstrate that secrecy actually inhibits or causes trouble for the home team when the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But on the other hand, and more fundamentally here, wartime heightens the interest in disclosure for purposes of self-government, because the stakes are never higher. And they're never higher for holding our government to account for the ways that it chooses to protect us. I think that if you don't take both halves of that dilemma into account, then you're not even really engaging the hardest and most interesting question here. I think that from the point of view of democratic theory, we have sort of a collision of incompetence here. I am not competent to judge what does or does not harm national security. And even if I imagined I were, I'm not accountable to anybody for the judgments I make. On the other hand, the president and people working for the president are not competent and are actually disqualified from telling us what we need to know in order to hold them to account for their use of power. And so I actually have, having thought about this a lot and talked to a lot of smart people, have been unable to find anybody that I would trust to draw that balance. And I therefore believe that something more or less like the status quo is not only a good thing, but almost the only thing that we could justify from the point of view of self-government, which is it's a process of competition in which governments try to keep secrets, and people like me and people who work for WikiLeaks try to find them out. And there is also an element of cooperation at the boundaries, because not only the mainstream media, but also more recently WikiLeaks has demonstrated a willingness to consult with governments and say, we have this, is there a reason why we shouldn't publish it, and to make redactions or to withhold things altogether when they'd be harmful.
Can I draw the argument a little bit finer? Because I think the way you've represented the dichotomy is exactly right. And I don't think there's anyone who could argue absolutely convincingly on one side or the other of this argument. In fact, most of us fall somewhere on a continuum where in the middle are simply the voyeurs who are enjoying what they're reading. And there are others who, on principle, would rather see more openness as opposed to others who may want less openness. But let's try to draw the distinction a little bit more finely here. You take a case like the Pentagon Papers, where over a period of time, people working within the government believed that there was a systematic deception underway, where the government was lying to the American people. And they therefore they leaked a large volume of material to prove that point. That's case number one. Case number two, we were talking just for a minute before this event, the so-called Palestine Papers, which Al Jazeera has obtained from Palestinian sources. It's also classified, and it now lays out many of the Palestinian negotiating positions. And then you get, as a third example, this dump of just a vast array of material with no particular purpose in mind, which to me is much more akin to someone walking past a bank vault and seeing the door left unlocked and deciding that he or she is going to steal what's in the vault, and everybody has a right to what's in it.
Now, I know on the grounds of morality, it's going to be hard to say that in one case it's okay to steal from the vault because there may be a particular purpose, like in the Pentagon Papers, whereas in WikiLeaks, where there's no purpose at all, somewhat anarchic, there's a distinction. But I'm willing to make that argument, and I think that's where we might want to engage tonight, because on the question of whether people have a right to the government secrets or not, we're not going to solve that tonight, I think. Do you mind if I? No, we're going to make life easy or miserable.
I do have another question.
I don't think I can go along with some of your premises. You said that a law question, there's no purpose served here that compares to the Pentagon Papers, and that is essentially amoral and indiscriminate. So a few things I say about that.
First of all, in terms of discrimination, there's a general impression around, and it's said explicitly by lots of people, in fairness, you did not just say it, that WikiLeaks has just sort of dumped 250,000 cables out into the world. WikiLeaks has obtained, I wrote this down, 251,287 different kind of cables, of which over a period of 4 months so far it has released, as of today, 5,415.
And entirely mediated through mainstream media who have been vetting them, have been withholding some, and have been redacting. WikiLeaks has not released literally one word of one cable that has not been redacted to the exact extent that Le Monde, New York Times, The Guardian, and so on. Not true, but we can get to that. Okay. I doubt we'll disagree that that's true of the vast bulk of it. Did they show wrongdoing or deception or anything that is akin to the Pentagon Papers in that way? First of all, I doubt that's the right standard. I think sometimes simply exposing what the government does, how it does it, is of an elemental value in and of itself. I think wrongdoing is too higher threshold. It's not fair. I think everything should be open. Let's just see a few examples.
First of all, as far as the U.S. government is concerned, you have cables that quite vividly demonstrate that public assurances about Iraq's road to democracy have forgotten to mention that the U.S. government has strong evidence that there's systematic torture by the Iraqi Interior Administrative Police, or assurances about Karzai's suitability as a partner, with very specific information about corruption and so on. Now, the U.S. government has made a decision, which might be the right one, that this is the least worst outcome, is to try to deal with these people and to cut there's no perfect partners out there. But do you refuse to tell the public that because the public, in your view, would draw the wrong conclusion, foolishly misunderstand its own interests, and cause you to change course that you believe should be right? I think that's inconsistent with democratic self-government.
So are you saying that you don't think the right things are being classified, or?
Well, that wasn't exactly what I was saying, but I would defend that proposition as well. Now, I mean, the need for sort of competition and cooperation and dealing with hard questions is not entirely based on you believing my belief that governments don't get the balance right in terms of classification, but they don't get the balance right. There's not anybody who seriously studied the question. I would be stunned if Ambassador would disagree with me that doesn't say that there's an enormous overclassification. There's no incentive. There's no incentive not to classify something, and there's lots of incentive to classify something. One example among so many I could name. I covered the WMD thing in Iraq, and went around with a search team, and we found suspicious-looking documents in Arabic with drawings of laboratory labs. They thought it might be WMD related. They had it translated. It was a high school science test. Boyle's law, behavior of the gas in the closed space. Now, the reports they sent back are routinely classified. This was an appendix. The appendix was classified, so now, I can't tell you the relationship between pressure and temperature of gas in closed space, because I'd have to get it.
Look, I once got a security violation when I was serving overseas for having a copy of the Camp David Accords in my office that had been listed as limited official use until it was published. And this was 3 years after the Camp David Accords were published, and it still said limited official use on it. So I don't agree with Bart. I don't disagree at all with Bart with respect to overclassification. I think the government is not careful enough about thinking through the implications of what it classifies. But I think before we throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that nothing should be sacrosanct with respect to what we do in our diplomatic discourse, we ought to be thinking quite hard about the implications of doing that.
Could you say a little bit, Dan, about what you think the harms are that have come out of this? I mean, you may not know specific instances, but the types of things that we should be
Well, I actually will give you a couple of specific instances to illustrate what is a much larger problem. We're seeing now the implosion of the Libyan state. And one would have hoped that at this time we would have a strong American embassy team in Libya, including an ambassador. As a result of WikiLeaks, which, as some of you probably saw, published a report from the embassy that characterized Gaddafi's habits, the Amazon women that he surrounds himself with, and a report that I'm not sure should have been written, or if it was written, probably shouldn't have been committed to the cables that were being circulated so widely. But as a result of that report, our ambassador started getting called in almost every day by Libyan authorities trying to determine what his sources were. More than that, we have a system in our emails when we want to send a copy of what we're sending to somebody, we put CC at the bottom. In the State Department, if you want to do that, you put info. So very often there's information that you're imparting to Washington that you want to share with other embassies. And some of our ambassadors reporting from Tripoli showed info Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, meaning the American embassy in Tel Aviv and the consulate general in Jerusalem. The Libyans accused him of spying for Israel. And he was then withdrawn by the State Department for security reasons. So we have no ambassador in Tripoli at a moment when we need an ambassador running the mission. Give me a second example. And I'm sorry I interrupted you when you said you don't know of a case where something was published. I don't want to reveal a source here because I would be doing what I'm arguing against. But there is an Iranian who is in the United States, a former government official, whose family has come under tremendous pressure, who has now been outed in WikiLeaks. Why? Because The Guardian didn't redact his name every time they had a report of a conversation in which he engaged one of our embassy officers. So the cable that was in The Guardian a couple of months ago says, black space said this, black space said this, black space said this, and then it has his name. And if you're wondering whether or not there's an impact of it, today, his daughter, who was still in Iran, and actually she got out today, was called in by the authorities to find out what's going on. So there is a very serious security and safety issue of our personnel. And there's a larger issue of the integrity of what we report. Now, I only mentioned one thing, Chris. What we're seeing in WikiLeaks is not even the good stuff. Because what goes into WikiLeaks is the reporting that the State Department allowed into the Defense Department's, what they call the SIPRNet system. State is underfunded, it couldn't figure out how to live within its budget and create a dissemination method throughout the government. So it dumped a lot of stuff into this defense system. The good stuff, when I would meet with Sharon, or I would meet with Mubarak, would be sent only to the State Department in a compartmented channel that would end up in other agencies but outside of the SIPRNet system. So the State Department recognized that it needed to protect the integrity of this much highly sensitive material. But even the things that are reported by our embassy officers, 5 of my cables are out on WikiLeaks, 4 of them drafted by my officers. They're all fine. But why would I have wanted the integrity of my reporting now to be shared by everybody? That's the part that I'm grappling with and dealing with.
Well, I certainly know why you don't want I mean, we're talking only about shoulds here, and I think let's also talk a little bit about the phenomenon and what is here to stay. What kind of revolution we are experiencing here, and the futility of many of the proposals for turning it back. We are seeing right now the arrival of a number of what used to be, in their own minds, utopian views of a group of libertarian technologists known as the cypherpunks. And so what you have now is you have a coincidence of mutually anonymous file sharing, massive collaboration on a global scale, perfect and free digital copies, interconnectedness. You have essentially the same forces that have demolished traditional publishing models and music industry, including, by the way, the publishing models that I have relied upon for my livelihood, are now arriving at the sort of privileged doorstep of government. And this disintermediating effect, as the economists call it, dramatically reduces the power of journalists and spies and diplomats, among whom I would make clear distinctions, to exercise their traditional sort of gatekeeping and filtering roles. I mean, they had exclusive access to information, they selected and edited for their consumers, they valued exclusivity over universal dissemination, and those models are under kind of attack that is not going to be fully warded off. So we can sit around and say what should be, but you know, the qualities of you know, the ways that I used to navigate these waters at the Washington Post and I do now at Time are not going to carry over entirely into sort of the new information world here. And we could talk also a little bit, I don't want to be filibuster here, but talk also about harmful and positive effects also.
Yeah. Well, actually, one question that I wanted to come back to, and maybe we should wait on this and finish up this conversation, but I know you in particular in one of your articles mentioned that the issue that the being, I think, disturbed by the economic assault on WikiLeaks when the cables came to light, where bank accounts were closed and credit card companies cut off WikiLeaks and PayPal and Amazon shut them out. And, you know, no matter what you think about WikiLeaks as an institution, I guess one question is whether this sets any precedents that will compromise the freedom of speech going forward, and whether that's something that concerns you.
Well, it sure concerns me.
Yeah.
And you know, let me say why. You had, at a time which extends to the present moment, when no one at WikiLeaks had been even accused of committing a crime, you had the bank that processed its payments and held its accounts in Switzerland pronounced itself to be shocked that the owners were not Swiss residents, as if that is the standard test in Switzerland, and locked down the account. You had PayPal throw them out on grounds that they were encouraging criminal behavior, which, again, had not been accused. They had not been accused of. Visa and MasterCard said they were suspending the accounts pending investigation of their businesses while simultaneously continuing to serve, for example, and I did check this, the KKK.
And by the way, WikiLeaks has disclosed that while this is happening, the U.S. government has been pushing very hard against the Russian government to let Visa and MasterCard into Russia and out of restrictive regulations that prevent them from competing in that country. And so they have a pretty strong incentive to please the U.S. government. Amazon, which hosted WikiLeaks cloud servers, which is essential, switched that off after Joe Lieberman, who's called doing Assange terrorist, called Amazon and said, you know, you better switch this off. Now, all this is a reminder that we like to imagine that the internet is a form of free speech, but in fact it is totally own. And you know, we imagine that we were sort of in a soapbox in a public park and we were standing in a shopping center and the others could throw us out anytime they want, or tell us to shut up. And the president is quite troubling, and believe me, if the U.S. government and its economic allies succeed in shutting down WikiLeaks by those means, it will not be long before you'll see Beijing and Moscow and others doing it even more than they are now.
I need to understand, Bart, one thing though, because my problem in a sense is not with WikiLeaks. In this case, it's with private first-class Manning, the one who actually stole the material and broke the trust that he had established, or he had been given from the United States government. WikiLeaks, in this case, is the recipient of stolen material and then the disseminator of stolen material. So I don't disagree that there may be some draconian responses to that, but I need to understand why it's okay under the rubric of free speech to be in a position that as long as the material is classified, and again, we're in agreement that there may be too much material classified, but as long as the material is classified, why is it right for a recipient of that classified material to enjoy the protections of free speech when it's in fact stolen goods?
And that is an indisputable parallel. Someone just for security. That is a plain parallel. I'm taking all kinds of reasons I can get.
Pentagon papers were classified. Many things that I have written in the last 15 years as a diplomatic and national security reporter were classified. I have agreed to withhold things Also, my publishers have agreed with the whole thing. There are times when we learn things that we did not even consider publishing because it was manifest that there would be great harm.
No particular issue for public debate. I mean, there are easy calls on both sides. If what WikiLeaks did, if what Julian Assange and his people did, was, and we don't know this yet, no more than to ask for, receive, and disseminate government secrets, and if that is a crime, then put the cuffs on me, and every serious State Department and defense reporter who has lived in the last 20 years and such what it is they'll spend on papers too. The reason why it's okay is that the law has not restricted that. The way that the regulation always balances competition. If you accept that there's a marketplace of information out here, that there's a competition between those who champ it down, those who want to disseminate it, and that it reaches some sort of equilibrium. Markets depend on regulation. The way the regulation is worked it is difficult and risky for a Brad Manning or for a first secretary in an embassy to obtain and to hand over classified information, and they have to have very good reason to want to do that. But it has not typically been terribly risky as a legal matter for reporters, although that is true now, because if we want to keep our agreements with confidential sources, we take a much better process now of being held in contempt by a judge and being fined or imprisoned. But typically, you could read the essay of that as making it a
death penalty crime to link to WikiLeaks on Facebook. I mean, take it literally. It's notoriously overbroad. Every lawyer has looked at this. It was, by the way, brought in, under the aegis of Woodrow Wilson. Would say the same thing. So, you could make a case against reporters for doing this. No government up until now has tried to do that.
That's one question. As Dan knows, we got many questions from students at the Woodrow Wilson School who were saying, is my reading the New York Times going to jeopardize my career, right? Reading about, thinking, if they wanted to go into
Columbia for a while,
absolutely.
Columbia recommended that its CIPA students not access WikiLeaks.
Right. So I guess the question is, what could the State Department or other agencies have done to sort of clarify the confusion about how far down the chain the culpability of private manning extends?
The dilemma of the State Department was that even though the material was now in the public domain, the State Department didn't want to say, therefore it's declassified. And so there was an effort to try to figure out a way to recover it, and maybe by limiting access to it would help. It was probably a very foolish and not well thought out approach to this issue, but it reflects the dilemma of having all of this material or potentially all of it, 5,000 cables now, potentially 250,000 in the public domain, and not wanting, in a sense, therefore, to declassify material that shouldn't be declassified.
This is totally understandable and logical, and it's always been the case that the U.S. government says that prior publication does not declassify something or eliminate culpability. And yet, it strikes me as a significant adaptation problem for the revolutionary forces that we're talking about. The Air Force said it would be a punishable crime by Air Force members to access the New York Times website because somewhere on that site were classified cables. I believe it's still the case that the U.S. diplomatic corps have been instructed not to read these cables unless they're specifically authorized, even if they have secret or top secret clearances, and there's nothing in these cables that goes beyond secret. Even if they have a top secret clearance, they're not allowed to read it unless they've had demonstrated need to know and got it through official channels. Which means that if you take that literally, that the political officer in country X is supposed to go around talking to his contacts, her contacts in that government, without knowing the contents of cables that his contacts have certainly read and are certainly holding him responsible for, and if he professes ignorance of it, they're going to think he's screwing with them. If you impose rules, however well-intended and however logical, that are preposterous and impede people from doing their jobs, they won't follow them.
No, it's true. Look, I don't want to cast aspersions at my former colleagues, but they were confronted with a horrible problem. Everything escaped, and there they are trying to do not only damage control on a policy side, but as I mentioned in a couple of examples before, damage control with respect to people's safety. And so they immediately stood up various task forces in the State Department to try to deal with the consequences, and some of the things they did were dumb. I think the fear that's been injected in people, our students' minds about accessing WikiLeaks is dumb. I think this idea that our diplomats, I don't know if State Department still has that stricture, but if it's still the case, it's dumb. But it's a tough problem for government to handle this in real time while it's also trying to gather in all this material in some way and maintain the integrity of the system. And the system right now is broken very badly. We have places around the world that we're simply not trusted as interlocutors anymore. And so the State Department's trying to fix the system while it's also dealing with the fact that the system is broken.
Can I say a couple of words about sort of costs and benefits of these disclosures? First of all, I acknowledge there are harms, there are costs. The specific Iranian example, now it's true that the U.S. government declassifies documents sometimes and redacts them and sometimes forgets that one thing for the name, as I've seen one recently, the declassified document, but nevertheless, that's a harm. There are times when names were taken out, but there was enough identifying information that I strongly suspected that the Chinese academic who said this, or the Iranian businessman who was known to have returned from Turkey within a very confined time period, and then talking with diplomats, it's not going to be that hard to identify by foreign intelligence services, and that some people will face consequences. A German senior political aide to the foreign minister, I believe, was fired because it was shown that he said a few indiscreet things to the U.S. ambassador or the embassy staff. There are harms, and it's not a good thing to not have an ambassador in Libya during this time. But surely that can't be the main thing you're thinking about when you're thinking about the impact of WikiLeaks on Libya or the Middle East. The disclosures in WikiLeaks, it's very hard to quantify and decide which factor is greater. There are plenty of factors here. Have got to be seen as a factor in this enormous revolutionary democratizing movement that's sweeping through the Middle East right now. And even if the Libyan people didn't rise up because they found out about Gaddafi's Ukrainian nurses or his son's plagiarized graduate thesis or his other son's corrupt business practices, this uprising followed in a line from Tunisia and Egypt and several other countries in which WikiLeaks disclosures clearly did help foment what was going on. They played kind of a double role here. There was on the one hand, there's a humiliation, which Dan knows better than I do, is a very powerful motivating factor in the Arab world. There's a sense of, oh my God, look at the world is finding out about our country, and the U.S. government is laughing at us, and they still do business with our government because they don't think we know any better or can do any better or deserve any better, and that pisses people off. On the other hand, there's a validating effect. Things that they suspected or knew all along are suddenly shown vividly to be true, and this was a powerful motivator for some of these revolutions. And while we can't be sure of the outcomes, just don't think we can say that anything that pushed these sort of democratizing forces along is all bad. And I've also talked to plenty of ambassadors who interact with governments who were embarrassed by some of the disclosures, who said, yeah, it's embarrassing, yeah, we got some static, but fundamental interests haven't changed, and they're still talking to us, and we're still right at the table and sending them home.
Well, I disagree, and it would be wonderful if we end up concluding that WikiLeaks was in fact the catalyst to revolutions in the Middle East. I doubt that's the case. As a factor in an environment of many factors, sure, we can talk about that. Friedman had his list of Google Earth and other kinds of things out there. There's a lot of things that went into this, including 40 or 50 years of authoritarian government in a situation where people finally got fed up. I have to confess that, you know, the arguments I'm making tonight are derived from my own experience. And I can tell you that I would not want to be an ambassador today in a post-WikiLeaks environment. And I'll tell you why. The
Effectiveness, to the extent that I was effective, the effectiveness of what I did overseas derived, I would say, to a large extent from my ability to know that the conversations I had, the interactions I had, the secrets that were being shared in both directions, because we also share secrets as much as we try to elicit them from foreign governments. We're going to be in some confined space. Now, governments know, as we know, that, you know, once you tell somebody a secret, it's going to be broadcast in some way. But the confined space here was government-to-government interaction. And I can't tell you, literally, because I don't want to reveal secrets, but I can't tell you how many times the things that I heard, or the things that I was involved in, or that my embassy was involved in, would have been undermined on the spot had governments believed that it was going to appear, not necessarily the next day, but a year later. We did a lot of sensitive stuff that nobody knows about. And, you know, I hope part of my legacy is the stuff that nobody knows about, that derived or was predicated on this assumption on the part of both parties that we could do it confidentially. During the Intifada, during the peace process before Camp David, solving immediate problems on the ground, which involved learning things that other governments did not want shared publicly. The stuff that you're now reading that makes our diplomats look so good, you know, we were talking earlier about the fact that this reporting actually puts our diplomats in a better light, because they did know what was going on in the countries to which they were assigned, and they did understand the problems. But their ability to work those problems was, to a large extent, a requirement or flowed from the need to maintain the confidentiality of sources and the confidentiality of conversations. So, and I was in two places where, you know, in Israel, everything leaks anyway. We were sharing a story before. When I was on the Washington end of policy as a deputy assistant secretary, before having a conversation with my Israeli counterparts, I would ask them whether it was for Ma'ariv or for the foreign ministry. In other words, where are they going to report it? Was it going to end up in the foreign ministry alone, which I'm sure had a box that they would, you know, for the journalists, as well as the distribution for the policymakers? Or were they going to find a channel that they could really share this more confidentially?
And they laughed, but they knew what I was talking about. But, you know, how much did it impede our conversations? A lot. It impeded it a lot. Our ability to get things done. You know, did I want to be thinking out loud about policies that we had not yet concretized, and find that thought process in Ma'ariv or Yediot the next day? And the answer was, of course not. But my ability to think out loud was part and parcel of my effectiveness as a diplomat.
Look, I am prepared to acknowledge significant harms to some disclosures, including starting with the atmospheric one that you're talking about. I mean, you know, the joke in Washington is don't write down everything you don't want to read on the front page the next day, but people don't really ordinarily behave as if they believe it, because there's by the numbers, there's very little likelihood that there's a situation you're identifying it out there. But, you know, when somebody obtains a cache of this scale, it may change the calculation. You could have some showing that. You could have, I mean, there are honorable reasons why U.S. representatives would say one thing to one person and another thing to another in the pursuit of U.S. interests. But there's one, first of all,
Described a clash of core values, and if they really are core values, you can't say, I mean, that there's no price you're willing to pay for self-government, for transparency, for participation. You have to be willing to pay a price, or it's not anything of value. On the other, you always have to ask whether the cure is going to be worse than the disease. And almost everything I've heard about how to fix this problem in terms of, well, you know, Assange is a terrorist, let's take him out, let's destroy his infrastructure economically or technically, let's prosecute him for, you know, for serious felonies that are exactly parallel to what journalists have been doing for 20 years. You know, those are pretty problematic. And we haven't even talked in terms of the benefits. I mean, I think they're fair. I read these cables and I'm impressed by the high literary quality and the analytic quality and the overall sense that U.S. diplomats are doing what we say we're trying to do, even if there's plenty of shading in comparison to of the public statements in comparison to the known realities.
But let's talk about what we learn about foreign government or foreign institutions. I mean, you learn about corrupt efforts by Pfizer to take advantage of the Nigerian government. You learn about the head of the London School of Economics has resigned because of the stories of the Papua. Those ceremony turns out is not only about the teenage sex on it, but also has done corrupt oil deals with Moscow. You go down the list, and these are having impacts on true misbehavior and true deception in governments abroad, including and in corporate, powerful corporate entities, including from leading democratic states, and that can't be dismissed as irrelevant.
You know, I asked you the initial question, I didn't expect you to agree, and you haven't. So what I'd like to do is open the floor to questions. I know a lot of people want to jump in and ask questions about this. Some people, before we started, were talking about asking questions about the Middle East more generally. So I think we can take both, but please, questions.
Jeff, I'll make the Central Foundation and Woody Wolf 74. I think the WikiLeaks major contribution was actually the Defense Department itself.
A year or so ago of the attacks in Iraq that really brought home something different that Americans hadn't seen, that the documents that are being released now basically put on the record in an unfortunate way, but had already been off the record or deep background, already leaked to newspaper reporters, other press people like Ron Karzai and his regime, and as you say, Bart, shows that we're much more literate. I wonder why WikiLeaks is obsessively focused on U.S. diplomatic cables and why there has been no effort to penetrate some of the other national governments' diplomatic or intelligence secrets, whether they have better computer protections or institutional protections than the U.S. government does. I'd love to know what the ISI's internal things are. One has a sense that for Assange and others with WikiLeaks, that it really is a focus on bringing down the empire. And I wonder if you all would comment on the difference in protections for American so-called secrets or secrets, as opposed to those other countries where there'd be a much greater interest in what they have been secretly reporting because they don't leak it off the record or deep background as much as
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about WikiLeaks, actually. I think about the implications of what this whole mess has created, and so why they're not providing incentives to get into British or Pakistani reporting, ask them.
The real problem is how do we fix our own house? And I think what Bart and I have agreed upon here is the fact, number one, that there's too much that's classified. What Bart just noted is exactly right, that a lot of the things that we're reporting were never followed up.
See, in 26 was reporting about an American company that was doing business illegally. We were reporting it from overseas, not just to be polite. We were reporting it for there to be follow-up in Washington. So there have to be questions asked of why the system wasn't working. Number three, I think we should agree that even if there is better protection of documents, Congress also needs to be looked at in this respect, because Congress, in a situation of classified material, has an oversight function. And where was Congress in the congressional hearings that were taking place, even those that are behind closed doors, the closed hearings? So there's a lot of things that we have to focus on, but, you know, if WikiLeaks gets into the Egyptian or Pakistani or Chinese diplomatic reporting, it'll, you know, that's their business.
The Egyptian stuff is all pretty fast because the Secret Service headquarters has been stacked, and I've sort of a good precedent on the public domain one way or another. Pakistan and I don't have better computer security, but they have better terms. It's not actually the case that WikiLeaks is exclusively focused on the U.S. government. It's opened for business in 2006, and its very first high-impact story led to the fall of a government in Africa, and I'm about to say I can't recall which one. It has exposed corrupt Swiss banking practices and quite a number of documents from other countries. But there's no doubt that the U.S. is a special focus for WikiLeaks and for Assange in his own worldview. I mean, he, by the way, is a perfect cartoon villain for anybody who's angry about these disclosures. I mean, you know, look at the guy, and he's grandiose and you know, accused of rape, and he looks the way he looks. He is not a great exponent of the principles of transparency, but there is in fact, and by the way, it's very far from transparency itself, there's a working side. There is an honorable motivation behind it, but there's certainly an articulable philosophy, which is that power ought to be distributed, that concentrated power inevitably leads to corruption and oppression, and the U.S. government, being, you know, the world's sole superpower, is naturally the target of that. I'm not saying I agree with all of it, but there is a really sort of novel tool for us that says information is power and it ought to be democratized. It's like arguing with the federal newspaper or something. You can handle it.
Question way in the back. I think there's a motion behind you.
Carl Meyer, I used to be a reporter and editorial writer in the Washington Post, and I was mindful as we were talking to the classes for your beverage. And I was on the paper in 1962. We're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the two missile crisis. And I think the reason we're all here today is there was no WikiLeaks when Khrushchev and Kennedy were communicating about a swap that involved the U.S. taking out its nuclear missiles to Turkey in return for the Russians taking out their missiles, on condition that no one said there was a condition. That it was always a secret. Don't you agree, Chris, that there is something wrong with the formula that Woodrow Wilson famously enunciated about open covenants openly arrived at? If it had been open covenant openly arrived at in Washington in 1962, we wouldn't be here. Isn't there something to be said for open covenants secretly arrived at?
Yes. It's probably consensus to you now that Wilson was naive in that regard. I think Miller has some humility about counterfactuals and about predicting what would have happened had this or that been reached. And Kennedy also famously said that he wished to God that his plan to be.
I was one of the culprits in that because
it would have saved him from a disastrous effort. I don't mean to worry about that either, but trying to predict exactly what the consequences are of any particular disclosure turned out to be notoriously difficult, and ultimately it's not normally knowable or provable
The wrestling match that I go through in my own mind on this issue is whether or not there's a specificity that's connected to some possible misdeed or violation of law or something like that. And I know it's not I'm not talking about a legal category here. In my mind, had Private Gellman been so upset about, I guess he was based in Afghanistan, as far as I understand, but he'd been so upset about something that was going on in Afghanistan, or if he was focused on Iraq or whatever, that he thought was happening illegally, or against policy, or against human rights, or against something else that was a debatable proposition, and put all the material out on that issue for the public to see, I probably wouldn't be as passionate about this issue as I have been tonight. What Private Gellman did, though, was get access to everything that came on his computer screen and decided that the whole system had to be revealed. And to me, that's incoherent anarchism. I don't know what other word to attach to it. So, am I consistent in this regard? Would I have applauded had he discovered or uncovered some misdeed in Afghanistan? I don't know. I assume I would. But it wouldn't be consistent with the argument I'm making tonight. But that's where I come out on what I call this continuum. You know, you can be totally in favor of openness or totally against it. All of us are somewhere along that line. And where I come out is the leakage designed to accomplish some purpose that is then defensible in terms of public discourse.
I guess, so WikiLeaks is sort of designed to provide massive amounts of information to as many people as possible. I mean, the example that you just said didn't use it at all. So, do you think there's any role for something like WikiLeaks or not?
You know, I don't know the mechanics of WikiLeaks, so if Private Gellman didn't have WikiLeaks but discovered these misdeeds, I'm sure there would have been a way to get them out without WikiLeaks. I don't know if you need this vast mechanism in order to do this, but I also agree that I think it's probably wrong to be going after it in a way that in itself seems somehow inconsistent with the constitutional guarantees and protections that we all want to enjoy. So, you know, there's a tension in that argument as well.
Dr. Reginald.
But how did the public discover WikiLeaks or WikiLeaks discover fraud? How did it
That's not yet known. By the way, I talked about popular competition. What's almost everything in regard to fair and fair is that if the government can prove that Brad Manning did what they say he did, then he committed a number of crimes, including some serious ones. And prosecuting and punishing him for those is a significant defense. This is a uniquely voluminous group. The forces that brought about WikiLeaks are here to stay, but this is it's not 100 years term, it's 70 years, 70 years, 10 years term in terms of the scale. How they met is unknown, and it is possible that the government was an persuasive evidence of fact that amended what I had to say earlier. If WikiLeaks didn't just receive and publish, if in fact the technical staff of WikiLeaks persuaded Manning to install spy software on the machine, and the government has stated that one of the charges is that Manning installed some unauthorized software on the machine. That could be LimeWire, some file share. But if it was something that's designed to scrape an Oracle database, to enable him to download thousands of files and knowing that to do it one click at a time. And if we could give that as a way of stashing information, then now you've got something that looks much more like traditional espionage. The one objection I have to charges against Manning are that he's, and the only one that's counted that penalty is that he is said to have aided anything. is the same thing as the civilian version of treaty. I would be very disturbed by that. And in fact, it's not the same thing. Traditional espionage relies on stealth, on the idea that the target doesn't know it's lost information, doesn't know how much it's lost, but it's exclusively in the hands of spies, all of which make it much more damaging. And by the way, this is so far from the most damaging leak in modern history that really doesn't need to be said here. I mean, spies, U.S. government officials and spies, Americans, have given away the design of the H bomb, the names of scores of human sources and scientists who were then rounded up and executed. The most productive eavesdropping operation in history against the Soviet Union at the time, which was tapping undersea communication cables, a long list of other things, all of which were infinitely more damaging than anything. Some of those spies were also executed. Actually, they should have been into terror.
I believe that, I'm no lawyer, but I think that the motivations of private dragnet don't have a legal consequence, whether he was acting out of some kind of conscience or out of personal issues. And frankly, none of us know, because the man has been held under solitary confinement for 6 months, and all that we have to go off of what he was thinking is part of one shackle. Actually, my question deals more with the general contour of the diplomatic cables. Like Bart, I love their literary quality. A British hack referred to it as, who knew American diplomats could write so well? And I'm interested in a lot of the things that are brought up that really, a lot of it seems to be gossip, or certainly not checked out in a way that, a New York Times story, or a Washington Post story, or a Time Magazine story, or whatever, would need the kind of more multiple sources and more checking out of things occur. So, on the embassy and diplomatic ambassadors, we can talk a bit about just how, how is it just something you hear over cocktails, or to what extent, you check them out, or you can put caveats in there. Bart, if you could talk about, to your knowledge, any kind of follow-up that's been done on Pfizer in Nigeria, or any of these kind of interesting little scandals that do relate to American corporations or things that might be, solid ground for American journalists to pursue. Because to my knowledge, we haven't really been going at it.
Look, there are a variety of purposes served by diplomatic reporting. One that is not is to compete with news organizations. It actually was a debate in the State Department about 20 years ago when a task force recommended that the State Department create an instant action reporting capability, as though we could compete with the young CNN or even the WikiLeaks that have a couple of extra days to check the facts and put the story together. Unfortunately, that was rejected. So the various purposes of diplomatic reporting, in large part, add up to value-added information that relates to something of interest to the United States government. So there's a ton of stuff happening in country X, but if it doesn't relate directly to an American national interest or a policy or some objective, then you normally would not expect your political economic reporting officers to be out there doing that. This is what I try to instill in the staffs in Tel Aviv and Cairo. Were we reporting something that Washington needed to know? Did it contribute to a policy debate or solve a problem? Did it reveal a problem of the kind that we've been talking about, an illegality or an impropriety? Did it help the president understand the leaders that he had to deal with? So you take the famous Gaddafi cable, people would ask, well, why would we have written that about Gaddafi? I'm not sure it should have been classified just secret. It probably should have been some compartment. But you write that kind of cable because leaders are intensely interested in other leaders. Those are the people they deal with. And if you do have an insight as to their health or behavior, what them tick, what motivates them, their weaknesses, this is extraordinarily valuable, and it may not be the full picture. You may just know, the Prime Minister suffered a twitch or a pain, and maybe that fits in with something that's been reported in other channels, and now we get a picture about the Prime Minister's health. So it all comes under this category of value added into the large cauldron of policy making, what our interests are, what our objectives are. Now, the stuff that you read about that look like gossip, I heard at a cocktail party last night that so-and-so is doing such and such to whoever. Presumably, if you understood the context in which that conversation took place, I say presumably, there was a reason why that officer felt it was important to report that conversation. So, for example, I'll give you an example from my own, not my ambassadorial days, when I was a more junior officer. I followed for almost 7 years a boundary dispute between Egypt and Israel over a 1 kilometer area called Taba. Why was it important? Because in the context of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, the Egyptians had insisted that every square inch of their territory be returned in the context of the peace treaty. When they went to demarcate the boundary, there was a dispute over this 1 kilometer square area. And how they would resolve this dispute was going to be very critical, because most border disputes end up in war. And here were 2 countries that were coming out of a long state of war that were trying to grapple with this issue diplomatically. So if you ever see the reporting on Taba, you will see a tremendous amount of minutia. Kind of everything that everybody said was important, because back in Washington, where the large policy community was following this, they were trying to make sense of it. 7 years later, they resolved the dispute through arbitration. Never went to war. It was awarded to Egypt. Israel withdrew from it, and it was resolved. So you look at this and you say, well, why did Kurtzer back in 1983 report when some deputy assistant legal advisors in the foreign ministry in Cairo said about the ownership papers of the hotel in Taba? There was a reason for it. It looks like gossip at the time, but if you understand the context, it would have made sense in that larger picture. This is the theory. I can't guarantee you that 257,000 cables fit into that category, but that's what we're supposed to be doing overseas in our reporting back to Washington.
Just to quickly answer the amount of pieces, I'm not a lawyer either, but I play on stage. I brought the notes on this. For the specific charge of aiding the enemy under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, intent is an essential element. It has to be in the context of armed conflict. He has to know or reasonably should know that specific information will aid a specific enemy, and he has to intend that result. On the issues of Pfizer or others, the WikiLeaks disclosures are going to enrich public debate. They're going to have measurable and immeasurable impact on events. They're going to make much better history in the short and medium term now that diplomatic cases are held for longer and longer periods. And they're going to be product for a lot of good journalism. Now, either there's an ongoing grand jury investigation into foreign corrupt practices in some of the companies that turn up in WikiLeaks, or there's not. There may be good reasons or bad reasons, and sort of accountability for that will be interesting and important.
I think there's time for one more question.
And perhaps both dismay and delight for Dr. Kurtzer and Bart is my own thoughts on this. I didn't speak for the other person now. I'm going to my life. I'll speak for my own.
Duly noted. It's being live tweeted as
I think Bart very much made something that I agree with. There were detrimental effects of these cables coming out. I think anyone who looks at them and reads some of the details realizes that perhaps some of our security personnel and State Department personnel have been in awkward, if not compromised positions. And I think for that reason, my organization decided not to do a wholehearted endorsement of the complete balance of the case. But I would also note from that that WikiLeaks did approach the State Department precisely the same way that the four media outlets approached the State Department to enlist their assistance in the redacting of the document. And the State Department, to its hubris, declined to work with WikiLeaks. And yet worked with the New York Times and the Guardian and the German. So there was a little bit of setting up WikiLeaks for the fall, because had they worked with WikiLeaks and provided the same guidance on the redaction that they provided to the outlet, I think it was a level of money fault, that's it. Right? My point, though, is we talk about detrimental effects to diplomats. What do you find about the benefits? And to give you a moment to think about it, I'll give you one. There's a client of ours who is a German citizen who was arrested on the hillside of Macedonia, rendered to Barton, tortured by the U.S. Army for 6 months. Mr. Halit al-Masri, German citizen, released on the hillside of Albania, and they realized that the wrong al-Masri, Arabic. So to keep walking and never look back. We filed a case in the Fourth Circuit alleging violations of his process rights, questions of what torture and confinement, some of the most egregious and working about. The government invoked the state secrets doctrine in court, saying even to engage this case would jeopardize national security. They kick out of the Fourth Circuit, the all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court demurs. The New York Times has a op-ed calling the decision not to review that case. The headline and the op-ed was "Supreme Disgrace." Level of detail not known always in the New York Times editorial. And we read in the WikiLeaks document that in fact it was American officials and the American consulate and ambassadors who were pressuring the German government not to pursue the Holocaust, not to pursue a parliamentary investigation, not to put too much pressure on America, on a German citizen who was tortured by U.S. government officials, supposedly. And so it is akin to Pentagon cases. In the case of one man, perhaps not in the case of 257,000 cases.
I'd be curious to hear your presentation when you weren't representing or were representing the ACLU. So, look, I also don't represent the State Department, so I will not speak for the State Department's reaction. I think it's wrong. You used the word hubris. I think I would put the word chutzpah attached to WikiLeaks for stealing or being the recipient of stolen cables and then going to the owner of the cables and saying, work with me on declassifying them. I mean, this was a foolish endeavor on the part of WikiLeaks. Makes no sense at all. In terms of the specific, let me finish this. In terms of the specific case, I don't doubt that there are probably a dozen, 5 dozen, we heard the Pfizer case, we heard that. I don't doubt that there are individual cases in this mass material that are going to prove to be very beneficial for due process, for human rights, and all the rest. I'm not sure, though, that justifies the actions by private manning or the overriding damage of which tonight we have only discussed a bit. If I had the entire platform, I could have given you a long list of very damaging impacts. So, sure, I think it would be great if WikiLeaks in this particular case or in the case of business illegal practices ends up being beneficial for bringing bad people to justice. but I'm not sure that it justifies the process.
Would be to say that if nothing proven that WikiLeaks is a different position than the New York Times would be really significant. What and when?
I talked about private manning. My concern is private manning. He's the one